I'm very grateful for this event. It's so beautiful to see people just breathing the air without masks on, without the social distancing that we had to go through for years. And this is part of, the story behind, where I ended up, which is, with you, free again to enjoy our natural bodies, the miracle of the technology that we're born into. And a lot of my journey has been about discovering the evidence supporting why we are not needing external support systems that are fundamentally poisoning us or oppressing us. And a lot of that work was very much part of almost like an angry young man energy in me, because I had been a very sick infant and child and experienced what I thought was a lot of medical trauma and even abuse that was institutionalized, ritualized in a way that maybe those who were participating in that system had no idea about. So over time, I grew to understand that my body was capable of healing itself, that I didn't need medication, that a lot of the things that went wrong in my life had to do with choices that I made. And I started to learn about taking radical responsibility for my health. And in that process, I learned quite a lot. I actually published a book right when the lockdowns started around the world. It was called Regenerate, and it was unlocking the radical resilience of your body through the new biology. And the irony was that at that moment in time, which was spring 2020, every bookstore on the planet was completely closed. And but it was a beautiful, poetic indication that despite that, I really feel it had a great effect. And now I'm seeing that a lot of my work, although has been identified as controversial, right? Like that you have natural immunity. In fact, I remember a Mother Jones article recently that said it's a conspiracy theory that you have natural immunity. And this was before people realized that they were going to roll out infinite boosters, the implication of which is that the vaccines are not working as promised, right? If you need a booster a month later, the vaccine is not working. And that's not even looking at the effectiveness and safety issues, really, which we know now are orders of magnitude greater than represented in the mainstream media. So there are a lot of things that you could get upset about, and I think a lot of you here probably were. There was a lot of division, a lot of animosity, maskers, no maskers, no vaccine. And witnessing this, it really kind of tore us apart. And so for me, a lot of the journey has been about finding peace within, generating health and wellness within, and then connecting with others who share the same values. So this is me actually just a few months ago at one of the most beautiful places in the world, which is the Sequoia National Park in California. And my friend who's in the audience here, Alex Wilner, who's also the creator of the platform that provides us our tech, which is Unite.live, he and I just pretty much just fell into a portal there, because these are some of the oldest and most beautiful and massive organisms on the planet. And for me, a lot of my journey has really been about remembering, and without the natural world, it's very hard to do that, because we are natural beings and we need to connect, be inspired by the beauty all around us and within us. So let me start here with the beginning of the story, which was, again, they tried to bury us and forgot that we were seeds. So again, the books were not available, and yet there were many people that ended up getting Regenerate. I intentionally did not mention vaccines in this book because I had been doing that for a decade, and it wasn't necessarily making me feel very secure in my body, because there was indication that there was an agenda that was going to be rolled out that would identify those who didn't vaccinate as being enemies and dangers to everyone else. And as we saw in the so-called pandemic, and why I say so-called is that if in New York City, October 2019, they did a live pandemic exercise of a global coronavirus pandemic taking over, right? This was the Hopkins Center, this was the Gates Foundation, this was the World Economic Forum. And they did these live exercises of exactly what would unfold a few months later. So when that word is used, I mean, it's a literal description of, premeditated attempt to convince people They had to lock down the world and do the largest wealth transfer in human history of something like $14 trillion, all in the backs of a so-called invisible particle that came from a wet market in, Wuhan. This was the, asymmetrical warfare that was perpetuated through the mainstream media, centralized, weaponized media, which we know actually post-Cambridge Analytica, it is a weapons-grade instrument. So we're talking about a real weapon. So they were able to architect a scenario where everyone thought they had to cower in a lockdown scenario, which is an active shooter terminology, because of a fear of an invisible particle, okay? So anyway, that is for people who want to look deeper into that word. But I'm not here to talk about this because it gets a little bit aggravating. And many of us went through years of feeling aggravated and angry and trying to understand how they could have accomplished this feat. And ultimately, I learned quite a few positive lessons from this. I think many of us here have. So where do we get the substrate for the reflexive, obedience to authority? I started to look deeper into this because ultimately, if you look into the history of the CIA's infiltration of the mainstream media with Project Mockingbird, for example, there's a lot of trauma-based mind control and behavioral control. And that's really what the media has become, It's not so much the violence on television, it's the violence of television. The medium is the message, right? So what they were able to do is co-opt what I believe is a collective trauma buried deep within the human DNA. And ultimately, I had to explore that within myself too, Are people wearing masks because they're afraid of the so-called invisible particles, new variants, or is it because of peer pressure and they're afraid that they're going to be shunned by their peers? The latter was more the case. People weren't thinking, right? Where does it come from? This is an interesting perspective that I want to introduce. Now, a beautiful colleague of mine, Raymond Neville, he unfortunately passed away recently, wrote a book called The Reparenting Revolution. The premise is that we have gone through periodic catastrophe, and that if you look at all the ancient, myths of our almost every culture on the planet, there's indication that we have gone through periodic impacts from meteors or comets that have caused complete eradication of the civilizations that existed at that time. We had to scrape ourselves back from the dirt. In our case, the last event was the Younger Dryas around 12,900 years ago, when pretty much the whole Earth got completely reset. So when you look deeper into this and you start to think about the way we've been infantilized, and a lot of the monotheistic religions, they basically create this angry parent figure, and that's reproduced, through state structures, governments, for example. There's a deep reflexive, obedient energy that we unfortunately have built within us. So this is relevant because of this golden age concept, because there have been periodic catastrophisms that have affected our species over great periods of time, geologic periods of time. And ultimately, it's so deep, the trauma, the amnesia is so built into us that missing is any sense that anything is missing. I mean, it's that deep. And that's what trauma can do. So a lot of us have forgotten because of our own personal trauma histories. So in other words, like I went through my own individual catastrophe by being born a bronchial asthmatic infant, getting injected with epinephrine, having to go to hospitals constantly, getting circumcised, There are all these things that we undergo that contribute to setting us up in a way that makes us extremely obedient. So there's an obsession, right, with the heavens. No matter where you go and you look at all the megaliths around the world, all these remnants of these ancient cultures, they're obsessed with the heavens. And why is that? Well, there's been a lot of work done on this, and I would highly suggest people look at Randall Carlson's amazing work. His podcast, Cosmographia, is amazing, and it connects to this, is that they had to navigate these cycles